In trying to understand patterns of NPP, we need to first focus on patterns of plant respiration. Respiration provides the energy for a plant to acquire nutrients and to produce and maintain biomass. Respiration might be a loss from plants, but it's a necessary loss because all the things that plants want to do, grow biomass for example, absorb ions, those require energy. And respiration is the loss of energy from plants in order to do these essential processes such as acquiring nutrients, producing, and also maintaining biomass. So it's a necessary cost. Now, the respiration of a plant can be partitioned into 1, 2, 3 factors. The first one is called growth respiration. And growth respiration is the cost of synthesis of new compounds and of new biomass. The second one is maintenance respiration. And once biomass is produced, some of that biomass requires maintenance that requires energy too. So proteins turn over, for example, they break down, they have to be reformed. All of this is considered to be maintenance. And there's a respiratory cost to maintenance of the structures. Thirdly, we also have respiration associated with ion acquisition. And often ions are acquired against a concentration gradient, and this requires energy to take up these ions. Now, all plants are similar in their efficiency of converting sugars into new biomass. So there aren't large differences among species in how much energy it takes to make new biomass. When we go and assess the cost of producing biomass, a physiologist or a biochemist would do it this way. They first would take a look at the different components of, say, a leaf. How much sugar is there, how much nucleic acid, polysaccharides, components of cell walls like cellulose and hemicellulose, the amino acids that are there and the proteins that are there, as well as maybe secondary compounds and oils. And this is for the leaf of a sedge that would have grown in Alaska. So we have our components here. In each one of these components, we can measure the concentrations of those components in a leaf. So a leaf might be almost 50% cellulose and hemicellulose, and 12% are sugars that are there. Protein concentrations are about 10%, for example, also, and there's not much free amino acid. But once we know the concentrations of the different components, we can then determine what the cost is of synthesizing each of these components. And there's a couple ways to do it, but essentially what you're going to do is figure out how many grams of carbon or grams of carbohydrate it takes to produce a gram of product. So here you can see that most of these components are in the approximately 450 milligrams of carbon to produce a gram of product. And we talked about how most biomass is roughly 45% carbon. And so then there's proteins, tannins, lignin, for example, but really lipids that are a lot more energy dense. And that's going to cost even more carbon to produce them. Once you know the concentration and the cost, you can calculate the total cost to produce a gram of tissue. And this would be milligrams of carbon per gram of tissue. And so you can see that almost half the cost of producing a gram of tissue is in production of cellulose and hemicellulose. Once you've added up all of these total costs for the individual components, you get a number here, which is 557 milligrams of carbon per gram of tissue. When people compare the different biomass from different species, for example, they get pretty similar numbers of between 500 and 600 milligrams of carbon to produce a gram of tissue. Now that's equivalent to 1.23 grams of carbohydrate. And a portion of this it's understood as being respired, and the rest of it's going to be incorporated into biomass. So as we talked about before, roots, leaves, stems, they all have similar carbon costs. And although they might have different amounts of these different components, there's a relative balance among the different expensive components that leads to a similar overall cost. So when we calculated these carbon costs, the carbon cost of synthesizing each compound includes the carbon that is incorporated into the compound, but all the carbon that needs to be oxidized to produce CO2, which essentially provides the ATPs that drive biosynthesis. So that respiration of material is necessary to provide energy that drives all that biosynthesis. So the cost of producing different compounds includes growth respiration. Now, growth respiration is important for the different compounds that go into tissues. And we talked about how some compounds are more expensive than others to produce, like lipids, which have a high energy content. And that requires a lot more carbon because you're having respiration of carbon to generate the energy that goes into the eventual compound. So we have growth respiration, which is all that respiration that's required for biosynthesis. The next one is maintenance respiration. Maintenance respiration is mostly for proteins. Some compounds, let's say something like cellulose, once it's formed, it's pretty stable and it doesn't really break down. And if it does break down, it's often not reformed. And so there's not much respiration that's required for regenerating cellulose. Proteins, on the other hand, turn over pretty rapidly. They're not as stable as other compounds like cellulose. And when these break down, by breaking down, there's the linkages between the different amino acids are broken, and these need to be reformed. Often proteins are going to be broken down completely into the relevant amino acids, and then they have to be reformed from the primary constituents. And this is maintenance respiration, and it's mostly associated with turnover of those proteins. The last source of respiration for a plant, when we decompose total plant respiration, is ion absorption. And again, ion absorption takes energy because essentially if you have a root in the soil, the concentration inside the root compared to outside the root tends to be high, and it requires energy to move those ions across membranes and into the root itself. And so that requires energy. But if we take a look at the patterns, the total respiratory cost of ion absorption probably correlates with NPP, because the greater your NPP, the greater the number of ions that you need, such as like nitrogen or phosphorus. And so because plants require more nitrogen and more phosphorus the more that they grow, ecosystems with high NPP probably have higher ion absorption, but not necessarily proportionally more. In total, when you take a look at the three sums across species and across ecosystems, plant respiration is a relatively constant proportion of GPP. And the reason for that is that if you think about growth respiration, that tends to be pretty similar for different tissues across different species. In addition, when we were looking at ion absorption, that scaled with GPP and was also pretty constant. And so then you have differences in maintenance respiration, which are associated with differences in protein concentrations. And that is one variable that can differ among ecosystems. But essentially, if you take a look at the broad patterns, plant respiration is a constant portion of GPP. Here's a figure that compares NPP and GPP across 11 forests from US, Australia, and New Zealand. These forests were taken across a wide range of moistures and temperature conditions, and then GPP and NPP were modeled. So here we have GPP, which is grams of carbon per meter squared per year. So this is how much carbon is photosynthesized. And you can see you have some that are less than 500 grams of carbon per meter squared per year, and others that have a GPP over 3,000. NPP, grams of carbon per meter squared per year, which is just GPP minus respiration. And you can see that all of these points fall along pretty closely along a single line, which means that the ratio of NPP to GPP is constant and it's equal to the slope. So if we go up from 1,000 and over here, that's roughly 500, and 2,000 grams of GPP, and that's roughly 1,000. So it's going to be somewhere on the order of 50%. NPP is 50% of GPP. That's a rough number for now. So when we take a look at forests, regardless of what the forest is, if we want to know what the GPP is, we can essentially determine what NPP is and double it. Or if we can figure out what total photosynthesis is and want to know how much biomass is being produced, it should be roughly half. So we state that plants have a growth efficiency that's about 40 to 50%. And that means it's the proportion of GPP that's converted to NPP. So this growth efficiency is the fraction of NPP over GPP, because this is the biomass that is produced, and this is the total amount of carbon that's photosynthesized. And again, we tended to say that somewhere on the order of 50% of the carbon that's photosynthesized goes to respiration. And that leaves about 50% for primary production.